Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Conversations for College Success. I have with me today Daviana, who I met at the Afros conference, and want to have an opportunity to talk with her because she was so impressive the other evening. And one of the things I'd like to ask her about is how or why did you decide to go to college?
Well, thank you first for having me on your podcast. We had a great conversation yesterday. When I think about the decision to go to college and the way that decision was made for me, I'm just used to um, fulfilling the expectations that my parents set. So I don't even necessarily remember thinking about whether or not I was going to go to college. It was just pick your major. You're going to go. I did get the chance to decide where I wanted to go. I moved to Charlotte. I'm originally from North Carolina, Jacksonville, North Carolina. And I visited Charlotte as a cheerleader. I had a cheerleading conference there and loved the city and said, this is where I want to live. So I applied to that school. I remember some other schools. I applied to UNC Charlotte. I cannot recall the other schools that I applied to because my mind was set. I got accepted. I went. I did not ever even see the campus until orientation.
By chance, were you a cheerleader there?
I was. I cheered for my first 2 years.
Congratulations. I think that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, not a surprise, and I say that because oftentimes parents do decide that their children are going to college, at least for their undergraduate degree. But then you also decided to get your master's, although I'm not sure that was on your original plan. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, there's a bit of a theme. So that also was not my decision. That was a collaboration between my undergrad advisor and my mother. So initially, I went to college to work in radio and journalism, and I had a major in communication. And when I decided what track of communication I wanted to focus on, we had this thing called rhetoric, which I'm still currently in. And I decided to study rhetoric because I thought if radio doesn't work out, I heard that people who study rhetoric and a little bit of history can work in museums. So I decided that that was what I was interested in. And I got assigned an advisor who taught a course on African American rhetoric, Richard Lehman. And I worked with him for a couple years. He was very supportive of my desire to work in radio. He got me to do a minor in journalism, and I was all on track until I think the summer before my junior year or the summer after my junior year, he sent me an email saying, it's a big ask. I typically don't place this on students, but I wouldn't feel right if it wasn't on your radar at least to consider possibly going into grad school and to pursue a career in academia. So he gave me the whole spiel all in one. And so I read the email to my mom and said, oh, isn't this guy just crazy? Look at this crazy email I got. And she said, oh, you're going. And I was waiting for the laptop. I was like, okay, this is a funny email. And she was like, no, we're doing a master's. We're gonna do it. If he says you can, you're gonna go for it. And she said, we'll figure out how and what that looks like later. And so I emailed him back and said, okay. I might have even said my mom says yes. And I said, when the school year starts back up, in August, we can talk about what in the world that means. And we got the chance to talk. I told him about where I saw myself as far as like working radio, what things I wanted out of my job. And he sold academia to me and sold grad school to me. And that was it.
Now, that brings up two things. One, in prior podcasts, I've talked to students about the importance of talking with and connecting with their professors, and they're always hesitant to do that. Now, did you approach him and that's how you guys got connected, or it sounded like he approached you and that's how you got connected?
So I didn't realize that what I was doing as a student was abnormal. Now, as an instructor, I can tell the students that put in a little bit of extra effort. And the title that my fellow academics used that had to grow on me was like just being nerdy. I didn't know that I was a nerd. I thought I was cool and just paid attention in class, and the class was fun and I liked it. And I would go to office hours and sometimes camp outside of office hours to talk to him about projects and stuff. And I just thought, this is just a cool thing to do. I didn't realize everyone else wasn't. I even was tutoring classmates, and I think he caught on to that. I remember a classmate ended up asking one of my, what was the word for someone that you're tutoring, tutee?
Yes.
Another student asked my tutee to tutor her. And it got back around, I'm the tutor, so you want me. And so I think he kind of caught on to that and just saw my interest and knowledge and saw that it was not just a class that I had to take to fulfill a certain requirement. I just really was engaged with the material. And so he saw that in me, and he decided that I should look more into a career that was going to continuously have me in positions to learn and learn and learn and learn and learn.
Well, I didn't know what nerdy meant either, so thank you for that definition. But the other piece I should share with you, because I had an earlier podcast, and it was about how people start in one career field and change to another. And in particular, when you talked about going to radio, reminded me of a lady who's a newscaster who decided to run for mayor. And so know that the skill set that you have picked up and that you're continuing to move forward with, et cetera, could actually lead you into a completely different career later in life. So just be aware of that, because I also don't think people are that much aware of that either.
I love that. I'm even thinking about now the full circle moment of going into academia and ending up here on your podcast. And it feels very much like what I initially had envisioned as far as radio.
And not a problem, because it means radio is still available to you. But it also means if you want to get broader than that, you can also have your own podcast. So this conference that we're attending, or summit, is something that you could utilize to learn more about what are my options. And oftentimes, people are doing more than one thing at a time. Don't know what your personal life is like, so not trying to do that. But we're going to talk about shortly, you're going into a PhD program. But I also want you to know, depending on what your interest is, you can still do track 1 while dabbling in track 2 to see how that works. Does it work with? Is it something separate? Always keep that, I'll say, as a secondary. And not to say there's anything wrong with your primary, but sometimes at some point you get tired of it, or it's not exactly as fulfilling as it initially was. And that's where, if you have something secondary, you don't get into burnout mode. I had podcasts on that too. All right, let's now talk about, I was so impressed that you are now a doctoral student. Talk to us about that.
So I can start at the beginning because the theme is still there. Once my advisor, Dr. Lehman, got me into my master's program, it was just a 2-year span. So toward the end of year 1, the conversation became, okay, so what doctoral programs are you applying to? And I did not know that that was part of our deal. So I went ahead and put together a list of places. Did not even know the ins and outs, did not know a lot of things that I know now I can kind of touch on a little bit later, but I picked schools that were in areas that I saw myself wanting to live in. I looked for programs that had specifications in rhetoric. That's the area of communication I'm interested in. And I also looked for professors whose work resonated with me, whether we read it in class or I was directed to look into their work from another professor. And that was kind of what I started with. I remember putting together my application materials, having my advisor look over them. And that was about all the preparation that I got. And then acceptance letters started rolling in. And at that point, I realized, oh, I'm really onto something, because it really was just kind of a shot in the dark at first.
Very, very impressive. We talked briefly about the schools that you initially selected, and then we talked about some potential schools. So talk to us a little bit about that, because I think that will help our listeners to understand that you should shoot for the stars and just see where things land.
Yes. So there were a few things I had to consider also, one of them being the GRE, for example. So with my advisor having the reputation that he had at our university, when applying to our master's program in the same department, I learned I didn't have to take the GRE to apply to the program. That was a great plus. And when I got into that program and he said, okay, doctoral programs are next, I said, oh, shoot, I might have to take the GRE. So I remember taking the GRE and getting a score that I was not super confident in. And I felt really defeated because I already have a master's degree now. I shouldn't need to do this. I shouldn't need to prove this. But I do remember getting a score that I didn't love and having some schools on my list that I said, I don't think I would have a good shot there. So I remember taking them off. When I ended up applying to the schools that I did, I applied to 5 schools. I was accepted into every single one. And at that point, it hit me, the schools that I had taken off of my list. And from then on, I'm even now, as I'm going into the job market and having another round of applications, I'm thinking of how I felt when I got the fifth letter. That was an acceptance letter, and super happy and super blessed and fortunate to be in the program that I'm in now. And I do believe that I ended up exactly where I was supposed to be. But I do also think about how, as we said yesterday, I told myself no when no one else had even said that to me. I'd never even heard that word from the point of my undergraduate experience until then. I'd never even really heard a no. I'd been told yes and yes and I'd still told myself no. And I still think about that and try to fight that even now.
Well, what ends up important about that is that's why one of the other reasons I wanted to talk to you, because it is important for students and even anyone who's listening, never tell yourself no. Let someone else say no to you. Because if you tell yourself no, then you're stopping yourself from opportunities that could possibly be available to you versus letting someone else tell you no, because then you can ask them why. And that gives you more information and ammunition for if you want to either reapply or apply somewhere else. So those are really important, a set of information that's critical for students to hear and learn about. Again, never say no to yourself. Let someone else say no to you. Now, let's talk about, you're actually teaching a class now. So let's talk about that.
So now I teach an African American rhetoric course, a Black rhetoric course, and it's very similar to the course that I took. And I didn't think about that until just now. I'm thinking about my academic journey and how I ended up here. I ended up here because I took a course on African American rhetoric. My course is called Rhetoric of Black America at University of Maryland, Com 360. We've gotten a lot of attention in the last few years because in the time that I got my hands on it, we've revamped it. So where it used to be a critical historical look at Black American rhetoric from enslavement into the contemporary period, we now incorporate anti-racist principles. So rather than just learning about Black history, we try to learn from Black history and take some of those lessons and apply some of those perspectives to our lives outside of the classroom.
Very good and very, very impressive and informative. What do you see as your next steps? Clearly, you want to finish this particular course, but what other things do you see?
So for next steps, one, job market and figuring out what that looks like, whether in academia, outside of academia, still continuing to shape myself as a public intellectual. I'm figuring out what that looks like and how that's going to feel. And I'm already positioning myself, even with the class that I currently teach, in doing that, only because I also want my students to orient themselves toward the public and the application of the materials that we talk about. Where that's going to be, I don't quite know yet. But I do know that wherever I am, there is that marriage between working within my institution, whatever institution that is, and orienting myself toward my public.
Very good. And I would suggest from that perspective, you apply to all of the colleges.
Yes, yes. We have a good, healthy list of places, and I'm being audacious with the schools that I have my eyes on.
Very good. Very, very impressive and glad to hear that. The other thing I'd like to ask, and I know this is right off the spot for you, but are there any, I'm going to call them key points or takeaways that you would like students to think about as they're moving through their career, whether they're an undergrad, considering a master's program, or even a PhD program?
One of the things that I try to play up for my students, especially because the class is now an anti-racist principles course, we want to think about how we are sometimes inculpated or participating in or resisting certain systems of oppression. And the word privilege comes up a lot. And one thing that I remind my students often is that any space that you enter is a privileged space because you never know who is there. That opportunity will never present itself again. You never know what you can get from that space, but also what you can contribute to that space. And so thinking of any opportunity like the one we had yesterday of meeting each other as a privilege, I think that makes a huge difference because even as we talk, I think back to meeting my advisor, Dr. Lehman. I think about the connection I have with the professor who will speak tomorrow and how that got me here. That I think has been one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in navigating academia, kind of as a first gen to grad school, at least. It's been a huge game changer. Other key takeaways is to be audacious. That's also a recurring theme, is just to be audacious. I think those are my main two. Did you say 2 or 3?
It really is whatever you thought was important for students to know. Now, let me ask you a follow-up question as it relates to that. And I think the words you used were showing up. And so I know showing up made a difference for you, so it really is that perspective. Either how did you decide to show up, or was it a challenge for you to show up?
If we are thinking about my undergrad experience, in particular, the course that I took and my relationship with my advisor, being present, being physically present made a huge difference. Like I said, I didn't think I was doing anything abnormal, but simply being in the room and being present and participating made an impression on my instructor and demonstrated that I had a certain kind of commitment to. I didn't see it as excellence, but for a lot of folks, when the bar is a little lower, it is excellence when you just show up, when you walk into the room and you're present and you're prepared. A similar situation exists for my students now, where I'll have students who will come into class and I'll hear them whispering that they didn't read and that they're not prepared for class. But just by being in the room, oftentimes those are the students that when class ends, they're still in my classroom and they don't want to leave because they're so into the conversation and they're learning so much and they're so wrapped up in the conversation that they're not ready to leave. But just by showing up, they learn something and they think they have to whisper that they didn't read, and I can hear them whispering. But I know that because they're in the room, they're going to get what they need out of that space.
Well, I think that's fabulous. And I want to highlight again for my listeners, showing up is half the battle. And oftentimes people don't think that that's the case. So thank you for confirming that. And then what about for where you are now?
For where I am now, showing up looks like being at opportunities like this. I mentioned tomorrow I'm going to be supporting one of my mentors who's speaking, but I have a pass for the whole weekend and she's not here today. And I've told you yesterday, even though it could be hard to tell, I'm quite introverted. So bringing myself the hour drive up yesterday to be alone and be comfortable being alone, being in the room, got me to this room right now just by showing up yesterday. And then showing up today, I've already met more people just from being in the room. And even as I was walking here, I remember being on FaceTime with my mom and telling my mom, "Oh, I'm really tired. Like, I really don't think I'm going to be here for long. There's so much traffic." We talked about the traffic, even getting here, and so many obstacles, telling me like, you could turn around and go home and no one would notice. But guess what? That's not true, because I would notice and you would notice, and your presence will be missed. And I'm learning that again, that makes all the difference.
It really, really does. And thank you so much for being so open and honest. It does make a difference. And it's hard sometimes for students to think it's important to show up, but B, to show up by themselves. Because if you're not necessarily inclined to do it, and as you mentioned, an introvert, it's not something that you necessarily look forward to. And I think what would really surprise our listeners is we met purely by accident. We were both standing, the three of us were standing in the back of the room, and then decided to go sit down. And it ended up being just the right conversation with the right people. And it was absolutely perfect. So A, thank you so much for showing up. And B, thank you for talking with us. And the opportunity to have this podcast is phenomenal. So thank you so much. I was talking with Daviana, and this is Conversations for College Success. Reminder, if you have any questions, please send them to conversationsforcollegesuccess@hotmail.com. Have a great day. Bye-bye.